Set up recording. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our special event night, Meet a Deaf Professional. So now we're really honored to represent and feature our guest, Mary Harman. Obviously, we have lots of questions with her, lots of answers. We really want to know more about her. But before we do that, I want to remind you all that you will have an opportunity to ask all of your questions and have a discussion, comments, tell your own stories, everything, all of that with Mary by the second part of our meeting, our session. So the first half, I want to know more from Mary in depth. Great. Okay, so Mary, can you tell us a little about yourself? Where are you from? What's your background? All of that. Sure. This is Mary speaking now. So first of all, I'm really happy to be here. I'm really looking forward to interacting with all of you and discussing all of these important issues. So really, thank you for having me. I'm very honored to be here. And I will try to keep it short because I know I will talk on and on about myself, but I'm Mary. This is my sign of Mary. I'm a Latina woman, and I was raised in the middle of America, and then I moved to Alabama, DC, moved to Hawaii, and now I'm back visiting family. So I've really traveled all over the place, all over the country, and I'm a formal civil rights researcher. Now I've established my investigator, and now I've established my own consulting company and working for other consulting firms. And I do a lot of work with communication access in the communication access field, and also working with a lot of intersectional advocacy, but also content creator on Instagram. I really enjoy, love being with everyone, learning and doing all of that. So that's really me in a nutshell. Great, that is wonderful. So you mentioned you were born in Oklahoma, the middle of America. So tell me a little bit about your family. What are they like? Sure, I love my family. Always love to talk about my family. So I come from a deaf, bilingual, multicultural family. My dad's sister, they're both deaf. Mom is hard of hearing. Partner's hard of hearing, but really culturally deaf. And so really extended family is hearing. And I'm curious, you mentioned that you grew up in Oklahoma, but you moved and moved and moved to all of these different places. So can you tell me about your education background? Yes, sure. I moved all over the place after I graduated from high school. I grew up being mainstreamed in public school, and I went to a charter school for deaf for only 1 year, and I really loved it, but the program was shut down because of financing. So I was mainstreamed in a hearing school, and then until my junior year, and then I went to Oklahoma School for the Deaf in Washington, D.C., and I went back to my mainstream public school for high school, graduated from there, and then I started moving all over the place. That's really my educational background, but really, my parents wanted to keep me close to home for school because the school for the deaf was very, very far away from where my family was, and my mom wasn't really comfortable sending me that far away. That was one concern that my parents had. So I was mainstreamed, but I always had access to language at home. So that was the decision that my parents made for me. Yeah, that's interesting. You envision a lot of people, some people from deaf families, you just always assume they automatically go to a deaf school, but really that's not always the case. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. That is a big discussion, both deaf and hearing communities, no one really has a perfect fit and a perfect approach. Often people are surprised, oh, you were mainstream, but you have a deaf family, all that. Yeah, I was mainstream. So I went to a public hearing school, and people who have a similar experience kind of get a similar reaction from people. But my parents always really thought it was important that I had access to language and the right accommodation, made sure that I had access to education, and everything was fine with that. So that's what I grew up with. Yeah, and I'm sure that's connected with our discussion today, self-advocacy. So we'll get into that in just a little bit. And the last clarification about your background, did you use any hearing technology? No, I don't. Growing up when I was young, my parents always encouraged me to try and just kind of see, using hearing aids. I did for about 1 or 2 years, but I didn't like it. That was just my personal experience. I didn't really benefit from it too much. So my mom said, fine, and just kind of let me stop. And I stopped using any kind of assistive hearing devices, and except for captioning, of course. That is a technology that I depend on. Very cool. Great. Wonderful. That's a great, wholesome picture of Mary. So now I want to think, now we know about your background, who you are, and everything. So now I want to kind of transfer to the topic of self-advocacy. So before we even, dive into that topic, what is self-advocacy? What is it? Can you just kind of define that? Sure. That's funny that you mentioned that, because that's a question that we often get. And, what does self-advocacy mean to you? And the answer is really, there's not one meaning. My opinion of self-advocacy is a spectrum. In this context, obviously, we're talking about parents with their children. Parents of deaf or hard of hearing children need to self-advocate, just like hearing parents advocate for their children, they have to advocate for their own children. And there's many different systems that make it difficult for parents of deaf and hard of hearing students to get through that. Often there's not a one size fits all approach. Some things can be detrimental to a child. And then, parents of deaf or hard of hearing children, there's many different approaches, but it requires self-advocacy. Often people look at children, when they're very young, they can't really self-advocate yet, but I think self-advocacy is a spectrum. So it means that, you don't really have to get up and file a complaint and everything. It's just really expressing your own needs and wants. What is okay with me, what's not, what is working for me. And that is also a form of self-advocacy. So for me, it's really always a spectrum. There's not just one specific, skill or, list of things. And it's really difficult to really say that one specific thing. There's just many different forms of self-advocacy. Whether that just be expressing your needs or filing a complaint or responding to a behavior, it's all of that on the spectrum. So on that spectrum, of the different ways, for our families right now in the audience, most have children who are, 0 to 5 years old. And I like that you mentioned that self-advocacy doesn't mean it's, adult things, but children can do it as well. They can just voice their feelings, they can voice their thoughts, and that is a form of self-advocacy. Yes, absolutely. Often people, toddlers, they're too young, I'll just take care of it. And I think toddlers do require a lot more guidance, of course, really, any young child, not just toddlers, but yeah, they require a lot more guidance, modeling, but it's really never too early to learn how to self-advocate. Toddlers have an ability to make it known what they need. Their facial expressions, their body language, you can tell something is wrong or something is working, but just by watching their faces. So children and toddlers are able to self-advocate in that way. They know when they're not getting equal access to communication. For example, often deaf and hard of hearing children can tell when there's other conversations going on around them and happening and they're left behind. They can tell. So yeah, maybe it's hard to articulate that, but it doesn't mean that they don't know what's going on. It doesn't mean that they don't know that they're not getting something they need. So really, it's very important for them. And I mean, they're very smart. They're very observant. So it's never too early to start self-advocating. modeling different ways to do that. You know, my mom, looking back, when I was young, my mom would often say, "Do you understand? Do you want me to ask that person to say it again? You know, do you want me to ask that person to sign?" And just me responding was a form of self-advocacy. It was communicating what I wanted. It was communicating that I didn't understand that person and I wanted to understand, you know, and that was a form of self-advocacy. I think it's really important for parents to model that, because then in the future, that'll translate to a skill. And it's really important to normalize requesting accommodations. You know, my mom was always required to go to my IEP meetings since I was young. You know, I was so young, I didn't really participate in my own IEP meetings, but I was there. And, you know, looking back, I just saw a lot of modeling of self-advocacy, and I believe a lot of that really helped me to acquire that skill, that self-advocacy skill. So suppose parents don't really know a whole lot about self-advocacy or advocacy in general. So I know a lot of our parents in the deaf community, deaf culture, ASL, hearing versus spoken language, it's a whole new world for a lot of them that they're entering into and learning about. So how can they support self-advocacy for their child while they're still learning about all of it, deafness in general? Yeah, that's always a question, because, you know, my response would be start at home. You develop habits and build off of that. Like, for example, make your home inclusive, include your child in discussions, and make sure that the conversations are expanded in depth. For example, my mom used to, you know, tell dad to, you know, dad's going to work at Tiger Air Force Base in Oklahoma City to earn money, and we'll be back home at 4:30, and that kind of thing, instead of just dad's going to work. So that really gave us access to that concept of, you know, the outside world. And the captions, sorry, interpreters transferring, go ahead.
You know, and so we had captioning at home. If you're hard of hearing, you can turn up the volume according to your needs. So, you know, we're a long way from developing habits, but that does build over time, self-advocacy for, you know, parents and also for the deaf child. It really goes a long way. Also, as I'd mentioned, you can mention to your child that it's worth for them to be included, to earn equal access. You know, it's worth having love. I mean, it starts at home. And fortunately, I did have, you know, resources that I could recommend at Gallaudet, Visual Language, Visual Learning Center, different deaf campuses, DSD for one, Deaf Mentor Program, you know, the National Deaf Center. And there are a lot of, you know, content creators on Instagram that are making a lot of content specifically tailored to parents of deaf children. And so it's language first. And why do we have sign? And also deaf, DEAF, definitely communication. You know, it's also great to have a mentor program. And I encourage parents to reach out and start there, because oftentimes they can make you other connections to other various resources. Yes, I really like how you mentioned the parents are responsible for modeling behavior. You know, that's to be seen. You know, whatever that behavior is or that skill is, I think it's important for the parents to start to take the first step. Yes. I mean, and like you said, having closed captioning on your TV, that's not a large step. It's one button. However, it is a big step in the bigger picture for a child. Yes, yes. Yes, pun intended, you know, it sends a loud message. Really, it does. You know, my mom always had the closed captioning on. She always said, read with me. And looking back, that really helped me acquire language. Yes. And speaking of language, you know, language and self-advocacy really go parallel together. If a child doesn't have access to a language, then how can they communicate their needs? And it really overlaps each other. You can't have one without the other. Yes, I couldn't agree more. And, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but always I emphasize to parents, one, if not the greatest gift, is to give your child unfiltered access to language, because language impacts everything from being able to express themselves, cognitive development, self-advocacy, being able to be involved within, in the whole. And so, oh, how precious, kitty cat. It's okay. And so I apologize. It's hard for me to really emphasize that enough, the importance of a child's language. I mean, you're right, Riella. If there's no language, then how do they self-advocate? So it would be more challenging. All right, well, speaking of language, suppose a child is hard of hearing and they don't use ASL much. They use a lot of spoken language. They're attending public school, they're mainstreamed, and they're doing, okay with communication. So self-advocacy wouldn't really apply. Is that right? Well, not necessarily. Often people who are hard of hearing do grow up and lose more of their hearing as they age. That's one thing. And also, I think it's important to give children as many resource tools as possible. I mean, often as they grow up, they realize, oh, they may want to use more ASL. That might be more of an access. Some of them may never learn ASL, and that's okay. I think it's important to give the resources and to let the child to be best equipped to make the best decisions for themselves later. And then generally, self-change, we change over time. So it's good to have that extra tool, extra tools in your tool belt. If it fits, great. If you need something and you don't have something that fits, then you're out of luck. I also think another good point you made, even though a hard of hearing child has access to sound, they have access to speech, it doesn't mean that they're hearing. No, because they still need accommodations. So could you talk a little bit more about accommodations that you grew up with in being mainstreamed? What type of accommodations you may have had, and how did you request for those accommodations? Certainly, I'm happy to expand upon that. You're right. Oftentimes people think, well, if you can enunciate, articulate sound or register sound, then you have equal access to information, as a hearing person that doesn't have a hearing loss, which is untrue. I'd like to emphasize. Growing up, I heavily relied on a sign language interpreter. That was my primary accommodation, just as closed captioning. Those were my two most used. However, my partner is hearing and grew up at a school for the deaf. Ironically, I'm deaf, and I'm sorry, my partner is hard of hearing. Grew up and attended a deaf school for the deaf, and then later attended mainstream program. So the accommodations changed for them. And, at a deaf school, they didn't need accommodations. However, going to a public school for a short time needed to be sat in front, needed an interpreter, needed, volume up for a movie or film and so forth. So the accommodations did change. However, with what my parents taught me and my partner was to be very involved in that process. And it was done by modeling. At a very young age, I could see what kind of accommodations I could ask for. And my mom always emphasized, if your accommodations need changing, that's fine. It might. My mom herself is hard of hearing. This was way before the disability rights laws were in place. So she grew up with lots of challenges. People looked down at her and said, you can hear, you can speak, you're doing okay. Actually, behind the scenes, she struggled quite a bit, and it really didn't start to feel like she could move forward with her peers until she did get accommodations and access to language. So accommodations have an array of kind: deaf, deaf-blind, hard of hearing, slight vision or hearing. So your accommodations will change over time, and it's also can be based upon situational. You know, your needs can change according to what situation you're in. For example, if you're in a classroom, your accommodation may look different than if you are on a field trip, or if you're at a pep rally, or, you know, so your accommodations change. So the education changes from when you're in kindergarten up to even 7th grade or 3rd grade. You know, it changes. Yes, I think that's a wonderful point to make, is that it's important for parents to understand that whatever accommodations work for your child at the age of 5 doesn't mean it may work when they're at 7 or even 10 and so forth. So I think it's important to check in with your child and have that conversation. Yes, you know, perhaps even before an IEP would be a good time. You know, the IEP meeting's coming up. How do you feel about these things of what you have? You know, would you like to keep these, or how's it working for you? And just, you know, discontinue something over another, having that conversation instead of assuming. Yes, yes. And we talked a little early on about the system. You know, it's like, it's not one size fits all approach, especially an educational system. You know, they have a criteria. It becomes like a checklist per se. Like, you know, if they can check off this list, then everything, hey, it must work. It's going to work. And not always. Often that is not the case. And you're right. It's the power of conversation. Sometimes that conversation can go a long way. My mom often would, even simple questions, especially when I was really young, like, hey, do you understand your teacher? Do you understand your interpreter? Sometimes my mom would repeat a few homework questions just to make sure that I understood, you know, to make sure I wasn't missing anything. And if I was catching on, then she knew in that situation it was working, it was effective. So it goes back to the parents. And again, I'd like to say, yes, it starts with conversation. I like the power of communication. It's not only beneficial for the family, you know, and accommodations, it's beneficial for the relationship. And so the child feels like, oh, they can trust you as parents, that you will advocate for me, and I can trust you in telling you what I need. And, you know, my access right now is not working. You know, I know it's not my fault. I know it's not my burden to hold. And, you know, let the parents take care of it and could, you know, control the situation and help solve it. Because sometimes I remember myself a long time ago when my interpreter wasn't really working for me. This was in the past when I was mainstream, and I felt bad, like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't tell, you know, that my interpreter wasn't the best, you know, and, you know, at least I had an interpreter. So that type of thing, it's like, no, it's okay to communicate that it wasn't working for me. Definitely, definitely, yes. And unfortunately, it's a common for deaf children that, you know, they're treated as a whole, as a system. So the message is, you should be grateful that you're getting, you know, the minimum. Be grateful, be thankful that, you know, if you communicate this isn't working, or this is, or whatever, you're not getting equal access. We don't want good enough access. We don't want them to feel marginalized. We want them to feel good. And it's important for parents to continue to normalize that, because they've earned equal access and come from a place of love. And it starts at home. And you're right. If the parents check in often, it also sends a message that I value and I care about you. I care about your needs, and I want you to be in the best position to succeed. And there are ways into doing that and approaches. Yes, I'm sorry, my cat again. It's okay. Very curious. So yeah, this is a wonderful time to transition to our Q&A part. So as a reminder to the rest of you that are here, I will prioritize families first with the questions. And then after that, if the families don't have any questions or they're done with their questions, then I'll open the floor for the other people to be involved, professionals, community members, and so forth. So we have a variety of options. You can open your screen and voice or sign your question. Just give me a little minute, a little time to spotlight you, and also so that the interpreter can see you as well, and Mary, of course. And then you can also chat your question, and I will sign what your question is from chat. Yes, Mary. Oh, I just recently, I wanted to I missed that.
Instagram.
Oh, I wanted to mention the Instagram account, and I'm going to put it in the chat. So if you want to check out those pages on Instagram, it's a great resource there in case you need it. Well, great. Now the floor is open for any family members, parents, family to ask your questions. Please do so now. Oh, I wanted to let you know that there are no dumb questions. Okay, go ahead, John. Okay, your spotlight. You're on the spotlight now. Okay. My question for you, Mary, you talked about your background, and I'm familiar with it being mainstreamed, and also, School for the Deaf and Brothers and Sisters. I'm curious about, were you the only deaf person in the mainstream of like 800 peers, or were there maybe 5 or 10, or were you lucky to have 20 or 50 deaf peers in school that signed, having like total communication? I know it depends upon individual. If they were from a good home, they knew how to approach deaf people. Others didn't, it's like, no, you do it for me. They don't want to communicate. And then also interpreter being frustrated with that. It's, I can relate to that. Like, oh, we didn't want the interpreter to think, okay, I'm lousy. It's not that. It's just, I have to warn you, there are schools that, okay, you're not paying attention. You're not paying attention. And oh, they're complaining because of that, because they've gotten in trouble. But anyway, we want to improve the process. So just to let you know that there are sometimes kids can play with you. So just check into their comments, but also to be able to stand up and say what it is that you want to have a complaint about. Well, John, I want to clarify your question. Your question is what? Did you have 2 or 3 questions?
Sorry, John, can you see me? Yes. Can you clarify what your question was? Yeah, Mary, did you have 2 or 3 questions? Okay. 2 questions. So Latino deaf, what is that like? Can you expand more on that in general? And including deafblind as well. Great question. I will try to go back and respond to some of the comments that you made. So I was mainstreamed. I was the only deaf, and I had a special ed program, but there was no deaf. I was the only one. I wish there had been more deaf individuals. And looking back, I didn't know any better. So I just kind of went along with it, thought it was fine. Luckily, my parents, advocated to get a good interpreter, have captioning, can't do that. That's not equal access. You can't do that. Did a lot of complaints, were very involved. So, and then I graduated and went to Gallaudet, and wow, I had all of this signing around. It was really nice. And so looking back, would I change it? Not really, because I am who I am now because of all of that, because of my experience. So yes, it's very important to have access with peers, similar, someone signing with me around my age. And I had some access to peers until high school, more because I would drive to meet people. And my mom always tried to encourage, meetings every week on the weekends, summer programs, things like that. So if I didn't have that, I think my experience would have been more negative. So that's my answer to your first question. Second, I think I identify as Latina. My mom's side of the family is from Mexico. So I identify as that. That's my cultural identity. And the other question, how can we encourage? And I think that's a tough answer because, well, you said some people kind of just lay back, and it's because they don't really know how. How do you communicate access to language? And they get frustrated, having all of these mismatches, and they just give up. So, they feel like they don't know how to do all of these different things on the spectrum. So, we need more of, why do you feel like that? How do we give them resources and really communicate? They need a better interpreter, better technology, more speech, more language, Braille, something. And so I think it's really important to give people that feeling of, oh, I know how. So I feel really empowered to do that. Most people don't really just sit back because they're bored. Most people sit back because of all of these barriers, and they just get frustrated and give up, and they're fed up with it. And that's my opinion. Thank you. Thank you. I'm impressed. You were the only deaf individual mainstreamed and you made it. Yeah, it was tough. Looking back, it was tough, but I was supported.
I had support.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. That was really great expanding on that. Thank you. Okay, any other family members have questions? You can type in the chat or open your video. If no one has anything, we'll go ahead and open the floor to professionals and community members. If you think of anything throughout the process, please go ahead and make a comment, interrupt us at any time. People are thinking about the process. Yes, take your time. There's no stupid questions, really. Yeah, and also there's no, oh, Sharon. Thank you for your wonderful, great story. I had one question. The IEP, do you feel that it's important for it to be signed and the child to be present early, about 4 or 5 years old? Really, it's a great question. I don't remember how old I was my first time that I joined an IEP meeting. I remember I was in 2nd grade, maybe 1st grade, I think. And that was my earliest memory of joining an IEP. I should ask my mom how old I was. Maybe she brought me when I was like 3. I don't know. I can't remember. But I think it's very important, yes. Just so the child can see what kind of conversations are going on, they can catch all of that and see what's going on, and maybe be able to express themselves later and recognize that they can't express what's happening and see the parents advocating and the language that's used and everything that's going on and all the conversations. I think it's really important for them to be there. If a child doesn't know anything, kindergarten or 1st grade, I remember I didn't say anything, but I was watching, and I was taking all of that in, and I noticed that my parents were asking questions and expanding on everything. So I remember being exposed to that and seeing all of that. And then ever since then, my mom is a deaf ed teacher. I should mention that. So she, knew it was really important that I sat down with my parents. My mom always advocated, bring your child, and everyone's like, really? Bring my child? And yeah, absolutely. And so, I think that was really important for myself.
So when I got home, I did ask my mom a lot of questions, even though I didn't at the IEP.
And so you develop that no matter how old they are. It's important to be involved, signing, interacting in those conversations and understanding, because it really helps them to develop language, right? Yes. And develop by a sense of belonging. That's really true for everything, culture, race, ethnicity, all of it. It's very important to, oh, okay, they're like me. That person's like me. We have similarities. I'm not the only one in the world. I'm sure you know this, but it's really sad, but many deaf children grow up, I would say until about 13, 14, don't even know that there's other deaf people in the world. They don't even know that. So it's really important to have exposure, access to peers, and so that they're able to later on make decisions and have that exposure to people and just know that they're out there. It's very, very important. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for asking. Okay, I got a direct message. I will share it with the interpreter first. 1 second. Okay, so that question says, do you know how your family connected with other families so you could be in contact with other deaf, hard of hearing children in your age group? How did that impact you not having friends in the neighborhood? I'll share that question with you directly as well. Thank you. Go ahead. I'm thinking. Let me start by saying that my mom was very resourceful. She's a very resourceful person. So how exactly she found that is a good question. I just remember my mom, being very active and assertive and contacting people. Back then it wasn't as easy as it is today with technology and the internet and all of that. But back then, she was contacting, I think just word of mouth, he heard about this person, this going on over there. And I'm trying to think, back then contacting people, I think it was the TTY a lot, maybe email, organizing events, things like that. So just meeting at a restaurant or a coffee shop. And in my time, there were a few programs locally that we knew about that served deaf children. Mom sent me to those programs, especially in the summer. Back in that day, it was much easier to do that. Well, now it's much easier to do that with the internet and the Tennessee School for the Deaf. We didn't have much of that back then. So it's a lot easier to contact and find peers now. I think the internet is a great resource. Contact your local deaf community, deaf school, all of those places. And so thinking back, that really impacted me positively. It was a great impact on me because, like I mentioned before, like my answer to John, I think the question was, if I didn't have access to peers, I think I would have really felt lonely and not like I have, the interpersonal skills that I have today, and not have the ability to interact with other people who are similar and be able to sign. And so it was really important to have that. Thank you for sharing that. Have another question in the chat. We have two. I'll read Connie's first. Can you explain a little bit more about how you communicated with your peers growing up in the mainstream, birthday parties, sleepovers, etc.? Did any of your classmates learn to sign? Yeah, like I mentioned earlier to John, looking back, I didn't know any better until I went into Gallaudet. So, wow, I didn't even realize that I could have unfiltered conversations, full, complete access. So I really think about how being mainstream really limited my access and communication. But I had several peers in high school, groups often from different schools, different school districts that I spent most of my time with. But before that, yeah, it was finger spelling a lot. My classmates learned some sign, but it's very limited, finger spelling, very basic signs. I was very involved. I would go to sleepovers, parties, played sports, My mom encouraged me to do everything, join all of the different activities, all the different clubs and groups. And looking back, I was involved, but yeah, definitely not equally. I was definitely not an equal participant, being able to converse with all of my peers who did not sign. And I think that's really true for even hard of hearing. You know, my partner's hard of hearing, and when he transferred to a mainstream school for a little bit, he, you know, could hear pretty well, but if there was more than one person in a room around him, he was lost. So I don't think it's really about hearing how you communicate or if you sign or not. It's really just the point of having the access and just being different. But yeah, my classmates did fingerspell, have basic signs. I was very thankful for specific people that did learn a little bit more, and I'm still in contact with them today. But looking back, yeah, it was nothing like talking with, I'm talking with Briella right now. It was nothing like that. I understand. Okay, the next question from Tracy. Are you familiar with language plans as legally part of the IFSP and IEP plan? I wonder about your advocacy related to an educationally relevant document that respects culturally diverse groups. What are your thoughts about having a specific plan for language, communication, and diversity, culturally respectful as part of an IFSP or IEP? Yeah, I would start by saying that I'm more knowledge and skilled in the ADA, you know, Section 504 more than the IDEA and all of the education. But I will answer that question the best I can. I'm familiar with the IEP more than the IFSP through, you know, my mom and my own life experience. But I think it's important to include the cultural aspects in those plans, because really culture affects everything. You know, like I said, as a Latina child, that really impacted me more than being a deaf child. It's just a fact. You know, my mom shared a lot of, you know, things, of course, but wow, you see often, sorry, go ahead.
You know, oftentimes in Spanish speaking, you know, a child gets less access. And so that child often doesn't have access to language spoken at home, and it's very limited English language, if so. So if you take those cultural aspects into consideration, that would go a long way. And, you know, with a lot of national events occurring and the environment of what we're seeing today, I think it makes sense to include cultural aspects within a child's education, you know, because it certainly impacts everything. And also in relation to what you were talking about with the intersectionality, you mentioned that earlier. You can't just look at a child as only deaf if they have other cultural identities. You have to look at deaf and, you know, Latino, or compared to a deaf white, you know, their needs are different. Exactly. And, you know, because I've seen a lot of people have a hard time understanding you know, racial, quickly explaining the intersectionality, and the interracial doesn't mean a person has various identities. It means how a person has different identities that overlap, which causes that person's, you know, to have more marginalized. And so if you have a deaf child, you know, if they're not going to experience oppression the same way if they're white versus if they're Black or if they're Latino. So the experiences will be different. So including those considerations within the IEP would go a long way to ensure that the child has an equal educational experience. Not only equal, but equitable. I mean, equitable support. Yes, definitely. It's beautiful. Another question that we have here from Brooke. She works as an early intervention specialist, working with young children. So wanting to know if working with quite a few young children, they have some type of hearing loss and have a hard time understanding how to help these young children grow in several parts of their development. I've been trying to educate myself on the types of hearing loss and deaf in general. What would you recommend I do better to help these children? And also, what would you recommend for helping hearing parents to understand their child that has some type of hearing loss? Help them understand better. There's two questions there. That is a loaded question. Great question, though. My first answer to your first question, I think it's important to learn from the people that you're trying to serve. I think that's really important because those are the people who have, lived the experiences. It's not something you can replicate, and it's really difficult to replicate through other sources. So my advice would be to meet with other people or engage with the content makers, those people, because that would be the best way to learn. And you can do that through online, you can through local resources here, Tennessee School for the Deaf, the mentor program, the outreach program they have. So even I'm having a hard time setting up in this area. So you could share your thoughts, your resources. I do believe that that would go a long way because you'd get authentic information from the source. So that would be my short answer. And secondly, to the second question, well, it's very similar. I think it's important to take advantage of local resources and whatever national resources are available out there. National Deaf Center would be one. And again, with today's technology, it's really much easier to obtain that. And I think it's important to engage with deaf, hard of hearing professionals. Again, they are the ones with the lived experiences. And so you can do that by capitalizing on your local resources, Briella being a deaf professional, other hard of hearing deaf mentors, professionals. And I think that would really go a long way in developing, habits, at home and beyond is, understanding your child better and understanding your role as a parent and developing that role. I see someone has raised their hand. Jenny. Yes, Partain, let me spotlight you. Great, thank you. Hi, I'm very fascinated with your mom, because in her position, because I too am a mom. My child is not deaf, my child is hearing or doesn't speak, has, would you spell that again, please? Oh, apraxia, speaking disability. At the age, and my child's 9 and started, helping my child at the age of 5. I'm very fascinated with stories of your mom. She deaf or hard of hearing, she's a teacher, but she didn't have anyone to advocate for her, although I know you did. And looking back, there's a strong focus on hearing parents, and I do feel lonely. They think, oh, you're deaf, you're okay, you got this. And it's different. It's a different world for me because my child is hearing. So of course I have to fight for my child's, language access. Well, they can hear. Oh, well, I'm really exhausted over this. So, your mom, how did she do it and work through all this? Well, thank you for asking. My mom, I'll just go with her background. She was born hard of hearing with some level of hearing. She was born from a hearing family, Latino. My mom wouldn't learn English because, she had a cultural identity to, being Latina. So she was later taught English. And even now, they heavily emphasize speech and not signing, rely on your hearing what you had. My mom can hear sound if someone is speaking. However, it wasn't access to language because she didn't have the concept of, oh, there's a middle name and there's a last name until she was 9 years old. So obviously something didn't work. And my grandmother, I never met her. She passed. My mom had me. And then up until 16, she did advocate for it, but then she started meeting other deaf kids that were signing. She got to meet and learn some ASL, and then she picked up that language. And then my grandmother passed. Mom was on her own again. And so my mom, is a brown person, so she had to double, challenge through that. She learned on her own, and she always said that her mom, growing up, she stood up for what was right. And so my mom just innately thought, well, I deserve access, and so it's worthy of standing up for what I deserve. This was long before Section 504, IDEA, ADA. So she had to deal with it until graduation. And then she said she never wanted her children to go through what she did. And so that's how she became an advocate for me. And then my sister was born deaf. And so my mom rolled up her sleeves and learned herself. She didn't have anyone to mentor. There was one time, there was somebody from PA Protection Advocacy that came. What is PA? Protection and Advocacy. A lot of states have PA. They went with her for like maybe 2-3 meetings, maybe as an advocate IEP meeting for my sister. And then from then on, my mother did it herself. But, she now will advocate for other parents. And so that's how she, that's part of her journey. And so for you, perhaps you could look within your own local area, protection and advocacy group, see if that's available. And, being a deaf parent is different experience than a hearing parent. They're both different. They both have their own struggles and challenges. And so just know that there are resources available, even though you're feeling alone and lonely and frustrated. No, it's not forever. And look at your child grow and be successful will make it all worth it. As my mom said, sometimes she, didn't feel good enough and so forth. But then now look how I turned out. I turned out all right. Well, there were times I didn't feel good enough. Yes, certainly. So did you have a second question? If I did, I don't remember. Well, thank you. Hopefully I answered your question. Well, it's encouragement. I needed encouraging. Well, go back to what I had mentioned earlier, how many educational systems, how they treat children with, if your child can hear, like they do the criteria checklist, your child can hear, well, then they could probably sign, go to the disability rights law. It doesn't matter. Your child has a disability, even if they sign, if that's the most effective way for them to be involved within communication, then that's valid. That's what the law says. So don't feel, remember that the law backs you up and don't be deflated by that. Thank you. Big hugs to you. Thank you. Hugs back. Of course. Thank you so much. Okay, we're getting close to the end. I think if you have time, maybe for one last question from Sandy, and then we'll wrap it up. She says she's a deaf mentor, IES, study, it's early intervention specialist. And as you mentioned, you're familiar with the ADA and the law. So suppose the family has a deaf plus child that wants to go to Disney on ice with hearing friends. The child needs to be closer to the sounds with less outside noise, among, other things that would help the child. Would it help, such as being like closer proximity with visuals? Would it be reasonable? for the family to request that accommodation and for their companions? Or how could the family find out, and who would they contact, and how would they articulate their needs? Yes. I want to ensure by looking at the chat, I capture. The answer to your question is more than reasonable accommodation. So for the child to be closer, and also the companions of the child. I mean, basically what this means that anyone who, in legal terms, covered entity basically means any business, organization, company that this law applies to. They have a legal obligation, which you also have to communicate with that person. That person has to have accommodation, and the person with that individual. So it is a reasonable accommodation. And so Disney on Ice is a program that you paid for. So it is definitely covered by the ADA. Who could the family contact? I would suggest perhaps contacting Disney on Ice. You know, the center, or the center who's hosting the event. Yes, well, the first step would be to request accommodation. Contacting the Disney on Ice would be one way. My child has a disability. This is the accommodation we're requesting. We need to sit closer. I need to be with my child. If they refuse, then of course I have no choice but to contact my state civil rights committee, and that often motivates them to follow the law. If they don't, then you would have to file a complaint. In my experience, most often they're like, oh, they realize they do have a legal obligation at that time you mention it, and they will do it. Just to clarify, by requesting accommodations for your child and to being able to sit next to your child, it's not a reasonable request. But for the child, the interpreter is just asking for clarification. If you request accommodation for your child, like sitting in a specific seating area, and also let them know that I also need to be seated close to my child. It doesn't mean that the request will be accommodated, however, it would be for your child. And just by the need to be close to them doesn't mean that they have to accommodate you and your child, just your child. And you have a right to be seated near your child, because you know, you don't need to be seated way in the back, because that's a different experience than what a hearing child would have. You cannot not allow a deaf child have, equal access and accommodations because they're deaf and based on their deafness, even if it is Disney on Ice.
Great, thank you so much. We have a few more questions, but I'm going to put them on hold. If you all have more questions, anything comes up, feel free to email me and I can get in touch with Mary, or get you in touch with Mary and get her to respond to your questions through email. Or just contact us. We'd be happy to help you, whatever. So, wow, really, Mary, I want to thank you for your time. I know we're running a little bit late. It's late at night. Thank you for everyone that joined, that was included. I really learned a lot. I enjoyed our time together. Do you have any final wrap-up comments before we say goodbye? No, again, I really appreciate talking with all of you. That would be great questions, and I really hope you all will take advantage of the resources that TSD has. It's really, really very important to take advantage of anything and all of the resources out there. I know, TSD does really great work. Thank you, thank you. Right, and if you have any questions, please contact me. I'm always happy, for this kind of conversation. Yes, and you can follow Mary on Instagram. She has a lot of wonderful content. I love looking through her posts. I'm going to post a link about the companion now. Thank you for that link. I really appreciate it. Great. So if everyone wants to open their screens up to say goodbye real quick, go right ahead.